I generally don't consider a project complete and shelf ready until it's based or set in an environment. Today we'll be doing just that to wrap up our Lancia project in this fourth and final part in the series. Welcome back to the bench. I'm Paul, and let's just get started. I began by testing out some angles and compositions directly on the base. I cut this base to size to be about as small as it could be to make sure that we're not left with any dead space in the end. Looking at images of Dublin streets during the 1920s when this scene is set, I noticed that the streets were dotted with tram lines, a feature I decided to include here to add a defining element to the groundwork. This tram track was extremely simple to make with some styrene strips cut from the lid of an old ice cream tub. A cursory Google search showed examples of tracks with a thin bar and a thick bar with a gap in the middle. So that's all I created, gluing the three elements together with some Tamiya extra thin. I did this in stages because the styrene was a little bendy and I wanted to ensure the gap down the centre remained even. I wasted no time moving onto the street itself, which I decided would be cobbled in this case. I used some Das clay, pressing it into thin sheets and placing it on top of a piece of card which I had sketched the rough layout on. Letting it spill over the sides, I used a texture roller to impress the cobbled pattern into the clay. This was done with a roller which I downloaded for free and printed on my FDM printer a few years ago. With the pattern in place, I cut a straight line where I intended our tram track to run, and I returned the scraps to the packet of clay. Before long, I repeated the process on the main area of our template, trying to get the base roughly level from lots of thinly pressed sheets. I've never seen a perfectly flat cobble street though, so I didn't spend too long worrying about achieving that on this surface. Again, the roller was used, and I did a quick pass with a silicone brush to sketch in any cobbles which hadn't been imprinted because of the unevenness of the clay. After that, I trimmed the edges using a ruler, and I moved back to our piece of insulation foam. I wanted to make sure I didn't melt the foam with any glues or solvents, so I opted for a thin layer of grout to first fix the tramline in place before quickly following suit with the clay. This is where leaving the excess on the edges came in useful. It allowed for a lot of wiggle room during this step. Once it was in place, we could flip the base over and cut away the overhang. As you can see, I followed an identical process for the main road section, just taking care here that the cobble spirals spin in the same direction on either side of the track. Finally, I added a thin piece of foam to serve as a curb at the edge of our cobbled section. Another free and useful 3D print that I used for this base was this brick mold from Thingiverse. All you have to do is press clay into the gaps and let it dry before popping the bricks out. I used some that I've made previously in this project, but if you want me to revisit how it works in a later video or a short, just let me know in the comments. I applied a nice fat layer of grout in this corner, which was to become the footpath in this scene. Adding distinct areas to a very simple base like the tracks or this foreground footpath makes a massive difference to the final effect, even though they don't really take long to do at all. The construction step for this path was as simple as dropping bricks into place, making sure that I'm sticking to the pattern that I set out for myself. You can see how the thick layer of paste allows us to wiggle everything around to make sure it all fits together before anything starts to dry. I ended up painting these bricks, but an advantage of making them from terracotta clay is that I probably could have gotten away with just a few washes or powders to get them to look convincing. I love these small detail elements on my bases. If I wanted to turn this into a more modern scene, it would be as simple as replacing the brick with concrete or adding some street decorations such as signposts or a bin to this corner. We can really create a sense of time and place with a few intentional material choices during these steps. For cities with significant Georgian histories, like we have in Ireland with Dublin, Limerick and Cork, it just feels natural to include bricks somewhere on this base, whether it's entirely accurate to a specific street or not. With the primary elements in place, I trimmed everything overhanging around the edges. This is easily done with regular side cutters. During this stage, I also added some thin card to the sides of the foam, using the exact same process detailed in my previous two projects, and then I grabbed a flat-tipped silicone brush and filled all around the edges up to the card to create a seamless transition from top to side. The grout can be smoothed and thinned out with tap water, which is exactly what I did to clean away the unwanted texture. We still have some low areas on our cobbles from the uneven clay surface, so I filled these with some AK texture paste so that they didn't look totally smooth. To be honest, this is a pretty unnecessary step because soon we'll have a 1/35th scale truck sitting directly on top of these areas, but there's no harm in covering all the bases regardless, I suppose. Again, this stuff just blended out with water to avoid any hard seams. After giving everything a day or so to dry out, I loaded up the airbrush with our usual black primer and I coated the surface. At risk of sounding like a broken record, a good black prime will mean that any areas that we miss later on during painting will simply look like shadows, or at least won't stick out in the end. I replaced the black with a light grey, and I picked out our curb before pretending to myself that I was going to spray each cobble individually. I quickly saw sense, and instead I painted an even mottled coat around the road, creating some variation across the surface. I still did pick out a few areas with an extra spray, but really that was the job of the next stage, using a brush with heavily thinned acrylics to pick out random cobbles in lighter tones. I started by using a grey, making sure different cobbles were randomly spaced and got different dilutions of paint, before adding a brown into the mix to increase the diversity of colour. Once I was happy with the cobbles, I added a range of oranges, browns and yellows to the palette, and I painted the bricks, again trying to ensure that no two bricks looked identical to one another. Finally, for the base coats, the tramline got a coat of dark brown metallic paint. I wanted to continue to add variation to this groundwork, so after letting them bleed into cardboard for a few hours, I used some thinned artist oils to tone down the bricks. I used an enamel dust effect, the same one used on the truck, to bleed into the cracks around the cobbles and to give a sense of cohesion and definition at the same time. This was applied in random areas on the cobbles before being thinned and blended out using white spirits. Back again to oils, where I wanted to give the appearance of oily, greasy, dark deposits along the cobbles that our tram would pass over. This was achieved by painting dark brown and black oil streaks along the road and around the rail before blending the streaks out with a wide, dry brush. Multiple passes allowed us to build up depth and darkness exactly how we wanted, without going overboard. This process was repeated to a lesser extent on the main road. Although there were cars in Dublin at this time, it would still be a number of years before these streets became defined by motorised vehicles. More oils allowed some more accumulated grime on the edges of the street, again blended away with the larger brush. Some white streaks, blended less, add an extra pop of definition in our newly darkened areas. I recently picked up a few new oil paints, one of which is this Azo Brown. The colour was not quite what I was expecting from the tube, but immediately gave me the idea of adding some extra texture to the ground. When paired with a darker tone and a white, this Azo Brown really just appeared as the perfect colour for bird droppings, so I decided to let my immaturity take control and I added them sparingly in the front corner. I think these ended up quite subtle, but hopefully they'll give anyone who notices them a bit of a chuckle. Next up, I used a small amount of ash from the fireplace and a dry soft brush to accentuate the dusty appearance of the street. With everything nearing completion, I placed the model back on the base and positioned it to my liking. I experimented with a few different locations for the figure, seeing if my instinct had changed now that the base was together, but I ended up sticking to my original plan and I fixed him in place with some black superglue. If you missed me showing how I painted this figure, just go back and watch the previous video. That meant it was time to seal everything in with a coat of matte varnish before hitting the sides with 2 coats of black to give the overall appearance a bit more class. I placed the Lancia back where I wanted it, and I used a piece of card marked with the centre point of each wheel to make sure I would be able to place it back exactly in the right spot. Again, black superglue was used to fix it in place, and I pressed each wheel down to make sure that it connected fully with the ground. And there we go. That's another project complete. This was a super fun experience from the kit itself all the way down to building the base today. Although this video is going to be out either at the end of October or the start of November, I actually completed this build a number of weeks ago. I even entered it in the IPMS Ireland Nationals at the start of the month, where it was awarded Best in Show. I hope you enjoyed following along the process with me, from building to painting to basing, and if you did, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment to let me know what you think. I think this project was a fun example of bringing lots of very simple effects together to produce a final effect that I at least am very happy with. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.